We're going to talk about three Florentine sculptors from the Quattrocento, the 15th century, and these are Lorenzo Ghiberti, Donatello, and Antonio del Pollaiuolo. For many people, Italian Renaissance sculpture begins with the competition for the doors of the Florentine Baptistery. And I want to remind you that Italian cathedrals often are a cathedral complex with three different buildings: the cathedral, or the church proper, the campanile, or the bell tower, and a separate baptistry. You're looking at a picture of the Baptistery of Florence. Now, every baptistry has the same dedication. They're all dedicated to Saint John the Baptist, or in Italian, San Giovanni Battista. This is a medieval building of the 11th century, but during the Renaissance, they thought that it was a classical building, that was an ancient Roman building, a temple to Mars that had been converted to Christian use. And you can see why. If you look at it, you'll notice there are rounded arches. So this blind arcade here. And the picture's probably too small for you to see, but there are classis-sizing capitals on some of these pilasters and engaged columns. So it had some of the elements that we associate with Roman buildings. It is an octagon, as are many baptistries. The original baptistry, the first one, is the Lateran Baptistry in Rome, and it is an octagon. And so there's a long tradition of associating the number 8 and an 8-sided building with a baptistry. Now, there are 3 sets of doors on this building. So essentially you have a door, and then a side, and then another door. And on the side that you might expect to see another door, this is where they would have the altar. So you would not have a door there. So the first set of bronze doors was created by Andrea Pisano in the 14th century. And I don't know if you can make it out, but let's see. If you look at this, they have a lot of little sections, each one with a different scene, and within that they have a shape that we call a quatrelobe or a quatrefoil. Essentially, it has 3 curving sections, and then it's almost as though a little diamond was superimposed over it, so you have little prongs sticking out, and that's a very Gothic shape. It's a very medieval shape. And you'll see that it's used on the north doors as well, continuing the same tradition. But it changes for the east doors. So you would have had wooden doors, but at different times, the Committee of the Works of the Cathedral, the Opera del Duomo, decided that they would have bronze doors created for this building. So, at the very beginning of the 15th century, 1401, they call for a competition. They're going to have a contest to decide which artist will create the north doors of the baptistry. Now, first, they were going to put Old Testament scenes on there, and that is why they used the subject of the sacrifice of Isaac for their competition reliefs. But after they did that, they changed their mind, and they decided to put New Testament scenes on the north doors. So they're having a contest, and they invite artists to submit drawings. And from those, they choose 7 finalists. And they give them bronze, and they evidently gave them instructions. They told them to cast a relief of the sacrifice of Isaac. And we have 2 that survive, one by Brunelleschi and one by Ghiberti. Because the figures in these are the same, And you don't actually have to have all of those figures for a sacrifice of Isaac. They have, for example, 2 servants and a donkey, besides the necessary figures of Abraham, Isaac, the angel, and the sacrificial sheep. So we think that they probably gave detailed directions that you must put all of these figures in your relief. Presumably, the other 5 competition reliefs were melted down so they could use the bronze again in the final doors. But for some reason, they kept 2 of the reliefs. Now, we don't know, but my best guess? Probably they were close competitors. There might have even been a disagreement about which one should be chosen. And so perhaps they saved these so if there was any question, they could show them and show why they chose the one they did. Okay, I'm going to show them to you, and I want you to look at them for a minute and think, if you were on the committee, which one would you choose? The Sacrifice of Isaac by Brunelleschi, or the Sacrifice of Isaac by Ghiberti? Now, there's no right answer here. There is one that the committee did choose, so you might think of that as the right answer. But some people think, well, they should have chosen Brunelleschi. I had a professor one time who thought that. So you choose. Okay. Just trying to make you get into the experience of deciding which one of these you prefer. And now I want to analyze them, talk about what are the differences, what are the characteristics of these. The sacrifice of Isaac is a very familiar story from the book of Genesis. The patriarch Abraham gets it into his head that God wants him to prove his obedience to God by sacrificing his son, Isaac. Now, God has told Abraham that he will be the father of a great nation. And his wife is too old to have other children. In fact, it was a miracle that she had Isaac, because she was supposed to be 80 years old. So if he sacrifices his son, how can that prophecy be fulfilled? But Abraham has faith. And he believes that this is what God wants him to do. And so he goes out and into the wilderness and prepares to sacrifice his son to God. But that's not what God wanted. So God sends an angel to stop it. And then he supplies an alternate sacrificial victim, which is a sheep that's caught in the bushes. So this marks the transition, in a sense, from human sacrifice to animal sacrifice. And then, of course, the sacrifice of Christ is, supersedes. There's no more need for animal sacrifice either. Brunelleschi's sacrifice of Isaac is dramatic and violent. As you can see, Isaac is struggling. He's twisting around. His form is very angular with the knees bent, and it's an awkward pose. And his father has grasped him by the throat and is about to plunge the knife right into his throat. It's right up against his throat when the angel reaches out and grabs Abraham's arm and prevents him from killing his son. So it's dramatic. And you'll see some things that also suggest the drama. You'll notice that the end of Abraham's drapery just sort of flies out, and it has these little butched folds at the end. Now, the entire composition of this is planar. It's set up in planes. For example, you have this foreground plane with the 2 servants and the donkey. And the donkey's body is parallel to the picture plane. So we sort of look over those, and then there is the main scene. And you'll notice that the angel is flying in profile. And Abraham also is a profile figure, pretty much on the same plane. Isaac has twisted around, so his torso is parallel to the picture plane, and so is his knee. The sheep his body is parallel to the picture plane, and then to give it a little bit more movement, the head is twisted around. Now, that makes sense. Think about Brunelleschi's architecture. It's based on walls. It's based on planes. And of course, the creation of linear perspective by Brunelleschi is based on geometry. And once again, this idea of planes. Now, there's a couple of other things I want to point out. There are some quotations from classical art here. As you can see, the servants are leaning over and sort of fiddling with their feet. And one of them has his foot up, and it looks like he's examining the sole of his foot. That is a kind of quotation from a very famous statue, which is a small bronze statue called the Spinario, or the boy taking a thorn from his foot. So Brunelleschi has a little bit of reference to classical antiquity there. Also, you have the figures, bent over in the foreground. You have some foreshortening. But there's one other thing you probably should know about this: how the figures were cast. Each one of these figures is a separate piece, and they're solid bronze, and they're attached to the background. And we're going to see how that compares to what Ghiberti was doing. Ghiberti's sacrifice of Isaac is very different. As you can see, the servants are not in front. They have their own little section, and they're divided from the main scene by a kind of curving rock wall. And we're not looking directly at the donkey. We have one of the figures with his back turned to us to suggest even more space, with this beautiful swinging draperies. You can see more of that with Abraham. Abraham is in a kind of arc, a kind of curve as he leans over, and the draperies wrap the body, but they have a beautiful curving rhythm all of their own. If I have to use one word to describe Ghiberti's style, it's either going to be elegant or graceful. And he uses all of these beautiful curving shapes. You might notice the drapery that flutters off from Abraham. Instead of being stretched out straight and kind of bunched up, it is a beautiful arabesque that seems to be lifted by the wind. The angel is coming in foreshortened once again. It's as though it's coming out at us. And you'll notice that the knife is not right against Isaac's throat. So the angel doesn't have to violently grab his arm. There's time for him to get there. It's not quite as frightening as Brunelleschi's version. Now let's take a look at the figure of Isaac. Instead of an angular twisting form, it's a beautiful, graceful form. Isaac leans away from the knife, but he's not struggling. And you see the torso of this beautiful, ideal Renaissance nude. It's a very small figure, but you've got your classical ideal proportions. You've got something that looks natural and yet is idealistic. And you've got that feeling of grace and beauty, which is so important to the Renaissance. This figure of Isaac has been called the first truly ideal Renaissance nude. Now, it's a relief. It's a very small figure attached to a background. When we talk about relief sculpture, we mean that they project out from a background. You know, if you go around to the other side, you just see the back of the bronze, not the figures. And I probably should tell you that there is another candidate for that, but it is a copy of a classical motif. It's a little relief of Hercules. But we'll leave that aside since it's a survey class. Now, Ghiberti's casting technique was different than Brunelleschi's. The entire relief was cast as one piece, except for the figure of Isaac. Isaac is a solid figure that was cast separately and then attached to the background. But all the other figures are part of the same piece of bronze, and they're hollowed out from the background. Now, this means they're not going to weigh as much because they're not solid figures. It's going to be stronger because it's not in pieces. And it's going to use less bronze. So it's going to be less expensive. So there you have two different reliefs that still survive. One is dramatic and exciting, and the other one is graceful. And we don't know what the committee said, but you could almost imagine members of the committee, one person saying, no, I really want this dramatic image, and another one saying, oh no, but this other one is just so much more beautiful. And then someone saying, yeah, and it's less expensive. And I'm sure that the efficient use of bronze to make it less expensive figured into the decision. It's very interesting because Brunelleschi was trained as a sculptor. Ghiberti's training was as a painter. So there's certainly something very pictorial about his compositions. But somehow he's learned to do bronze casting and do it in a very efficient way. So Ghiberti won the competition to create the north doors of the Baptistery of Florence, and he created New Testament scenes from about 1403 to 1425. When the north doors were finished, Ghiberti was given the commission for the east doors. Now, these are the doors that face east, and they're facing directly to the entrance of the cathedral, the west side, the main entrance of the cathedral. So these are considered to be very important doors. And it took him more than 25 years to complete them. So for about 50 years, Ghiberti is working on these doors. And for many of those years, he would have had a bronze factory going. We think that probably, the next generations of younger sculptors in Florence learned bronze casting by assisting in the creation of these doors. Now, the east doors are Old Testament scenes, but they have a special name that has been given to them. They're known as the Gates of Paradise. It's Italian, the Porta della Paradisia. So they could be translated as the Gates of Paradise, the Doors of Paradise, or the Portals of Paradise. And where did this name come from? This name was actually given to them in the 16th century by Michelangelo himself. He said that these doors were so beautiful that they were worthy to be the gates of paradise, the gates of heaven themselves. And it's also been suggested that that's appropriate because Christians believe that you must be baptized in order to enter into paradise, enter into heaven. So, in a sense, these are the gates of paradise. They give you entry. But I think with Michelangelo, he probably was talking about the beauty of the doors. So here are the gates of paradise, or the east doors of the Baptistery of Florence. Now, immediately you notice something. The shape is different than the shape that you saw with the sacrifice of Isaac. Instead of that Gothic quadrilobe, you see rectangular shapes, almost like window frames. And indeed, Alberti speaks of a painting, but it certainly works for relief sculpture, as being a window into the world, or into a world. These are Old Testament scenes, and they are gilded bronze. By gilding, we mean that they are covered with gold leaf. Now, you notice that those two pictures I had, one of them, they were all gold, and this would have some sort of dark, splotchy areas. That's because gold leaf flakes off. We don't have the original gilding. It's flaked off and been replaced. It usually will flake off in the highest part. So sometimes it almost looks like a negative, photographic negative. But it is not always in pristine condition. As it flakes off, you have to have the funds to replace the gilding. So sometimes you'll see photographs of it with only partial gilding. We're going to look at one of these scenes. And what you're seeing here, of course, is several scenes from the story of Jacob and Esau. And they're all put together in one setting. We call this simultaneous representation. And it's a way of telling a story. Now, one thing I think you can see just by looking at this is that it is using linear perspective, and the space is believable. You have figures in the foreground, you have these great arches of the building, and then in very shallow relief in the background, or in very shallow relief further back, you have the arches of another wall. So it leads you back into space. And if you look at the base, you can see the perspective lines. You can see that kind of grid that is created when the artist is trying to figure out the linear perspective, the one-point perspective. Okay, what's the story of Jacob and Esau? Well, it's a story of a dysfunctional family. These are the sons of Isaac. Now, Isaac is all growing up. He is an old man. He has lost his eyesight. He's blind. And he has two sons, and they don't get along at all. They are twins, but they're obviously fraternal twins. And it's said that they fought each other even in their mother's womb. The first to be born was Esau. And Esau becomes his father's favorite. Jacob was born second, and it was said that he was grasping his brother's heel just as he was born, not because he loves his brother so much, because they were actually fighting even then, even at birth. Jacob is his mother's favorite. Isaac married Rebekah. So, we see a number of scenes here. If you look at the center, beyond the figures right in the front, we'll talk about them in a few minutes, you'll see just part of one figure, which I think is Jacob, covered up, and another figure leaning forward, gesturing, and he's throwing a bow down there on the ground. Well, let's tell you about these brothers. Esau was an outdoorsman. He was a hunter. And he would go out and hunt and bring back game and prepare it for his father. But one time he goes out hunting and he either doesn't catch anything or he doesn't have time to cook. He comes back and he is so hungry. And he sees his brother Jacob making a stew or a soup. And he says, give me a bowl of soup because I'm starving. I'm so hungry. And Jacob just looks at him and says, "You want a bowl of soup? Give me your birthright." Now, by the birthright, we mean his inheritance. Because Esau is the older son under primogeniture, the oldest son inherits everything. Jacob's obviously upset about this, and so he tells Esau that he will give him a plate of soup if Esau gives him his birthright. And what does Esau say? He says, "What good does my birthright do me if I starve to death? Give me the soup." Well, we look at that and we say, boy, his brother is so mean. Why didn't he just give him some soup? Now, play nice, kids. But the way the medieval theologians interpreted this, they interpreted it as an allegory. They said that Esau stood for the worldly man, the person who was so blinded by the things of the earth that they would give away spiritual values, the important things for the worldly. So the soup represents, the worldly things that are just there one moment and gone the next. Eat it up really fast. And the birthright represents spiritual things, something that's really valuable. And Esau just gives it away. Okay, when the father, Isaac, hears what has happened, he says to his favorite son Esau, "I want to give you something. I will give you my blessing. That's all I have left to give you." And so I think this is what's going on right here in the front, that Isaac is telling Esau, and I think it's Esau because he's got his hunting dog next to him. He's telling him what he's going to do. He's going to give him a blessing. But first he wants Esau to go out and go hunting and catch him the game and then make this, this game stew that he likes so well. And then he will give him his blessing. So Esau goes off, and you can see him on the far right, going up the hill with the bow over his shoulder in a very, very shallow relief, which helps to suggest that it is further back in space. It's kind of atmospheric. Then down here in the lower corner, we see essentially two scenes. The lower right, a little bit back in shallow relief, you see the mother, Rebecca, and Jacob. And Jacob is holding a kid, a baby goat that has been killed. He's holding him upside down. And they're plotting to get the blessing for Jacob. And, Rebecca says, "This is what we're going to do. We will kill a domestic kid, and, you will pretend that you are Esau, and you'll make the stew out of the kid, and then you will receive the blessing that was intended for Esau." And Jacob says, "Well, this can't work. My father's blind, but he'll feel me. He'll know I'm not Esau because my brother is a hairy man." And Rebecca suggests that they take the skin with the fur of the kid and they put it on his chest and his arms and, wherever Esau is hairiest. And so when the blind father reaches out to feel his son to see whether it is Jacob or Esau, he feels the fur, the hair of the kid, and thinks that it's his hairy son, Esau. And that's what you see in the lower part, where Jacob is receiving the blessing from his father, with Rachel with Rebecca standing by. Okay, what happens next? Well, Esau comes back, and you can imagine how he feels. His brother has stolen his birthright, and now his brother has stolen by trickery even the blessing that was intended for him. He is furious. He says, I'm going to kill him. And Jacob decides it's probably prudent to get out of the way, and he takes off. He leaves, and he goes away for literally years and years and years. And he has various adventures. He sees a vision of a ladder going up to heaven, so-called Jacob's ladder. And he comes upon a kinsman whom he works with for many years. They are herdsmen. One of the things that fascinated me about the story was that Jacob seems to know something about genetics, because he makes a deal with his kinsman that all of the spotted animals will become Jacob's, and all the single-colored animals will remain, his, I'm not sure it's an uncle or cousin or whatever, but his kinsman's. And Jacob makes sure that the sheep and goat breed so that there's lots of spotted animals. And he becomes very, very wealthy. He falls in love with the younger daughter, Rachel. And her father says, you have to work for me for, I think it's 9 years, but for many years. And then at the wedding, he substitutes the veiled bride. He substitutes the older daughter, Leah. Now, this was a time when you could have 2 wives. Jacob is very upset, but his father-in-law says, okay, work another 9 years, and you can marry my younger daughter as well. And he does this. So he has 2 wives and many children. In fact, it is the 12 tribes of Israel that descend from the children of Jacob and Leah and Jacob and Rachel. Well, now he's wealthy. He probably doesn't need his brother's birthright, and he goes back to be reconciled with his brother. Well, that's the story. Let's look a little bit more about how Ghiberti creates this picture. One of the things you'll notice is both the architecture and some of the clothing are classical in style. The architecture with these simple rounded arches and pilasters, looks very Roman, but as though it were a very early period because it's so simple. Now, this certainly wouldn't have been what Abraham would have lived in. They were herdsmen, but it gives you this feeling of dignified antiquity, if you will. And you'll notice that Isaac and Rebecca are both wearing draperies that could be considered classical. And also you have this group of young ladies at the side. We're going to talk a little bit more about them. And they are beautiful, ideal figures dressed in classical garments. The 2 young men, Jacob and Esau, are wearing clothing that would be a lot closer to what a young man about Florence in the early 15th century would be wearing. He's got a tunic, and he's got probably hose that he's wearing with the short tunic. The figures all have beautiful proportions, and some of them, particularly female figures, are particularly graceful. You'll notice there's these, who are these women? Well, they seem to be extras. Presumably they're servants. Although they could perhaps be, maybe some of them could be the 2 of the wives of Jacob, but presumably they're servants around the house of Isaac. And you'll notice you have the one with the back turned to us with this graceful curving shape of the drapery folds, and how the drapery sort of clings to the body and lets you believe that there is a figure beneath it, and the curving lines of the other draperies. The figure on the far left, holding a bundle on her head, is a very familiar type of figure that we see in 15th century Renaissance art. She's wearing a classical garment. If you remember the relief I showed you with the billowing drapery or veil coming out as a semicircle behind her, you see that kind of thing here, and a little fluttery quality at the foot, as though she's actually moving. And of course, little poofs over the stomach area. So it's a very classical garment. And we see figures like this, the graceful figure with the fluttering drapery in a drawing by Botticelli, in a painting by Ghirlandaio, and a statue by Donatello. The statue was the Dovitia, and it was up on a great pillar, but alas, it no longer survives. So either a classical model could have been the source for all of these, or perhaps Donatello's Dovitia. Donatello is perhaps the most famous of the 15th century Florentine sculptors before Michelangelo. When I try to sum up the style of some of these artists, I'll say that Ghiberti is graceful or elegant. And for Donatello, there's such a variety in his statuary that the word I come up with is expressive. That many of his figures seem to have a real character, that idea of the movements of the mind. It's almost as though they're thinking and feeling. So let's take a look at that, see what I'm talking about. The statue you're looking at is the Saint George by Donatello. Saint George, of course, was a warrior saint, often shown as a knight. He's famous for killing a dragon and saving a princess. Now, in the early 15th century, there was a major commission that went out to many different sculptors. There was this large building called Or San Michele. It had been a grain market, but it had been converted into a church. It's still a church. And on the outside of the building, they built niches. And each guild in Florence was supposed to commission a statue. Some of them are in bronze, which is very expensive. Some of them are in marble. This statue was commissioned by the Armorers Guild. And we can tell from some of the marks that are left on it that he once had an actual metal helmet. He also once held a sword, which would have stuck out a little bit above the heads of passerbys, I might say, but in a sense sticking out and into the world of the people who are real and are passing by. And you could see in a sense that becomes a kind of advertisement for the guild's products, as well as showing them a saint who would have used their products, the armor. Now, when we look at St. George, it's not the stereotypical hero and knight who we think of as sort of having a square jaw and looking very, very brave and not being afraid at all. But is that really what a hero is? And that's what I find so interesting about some of Donatello's statues. They really give you, with the facial expression and the pose, they really give you the feeling that the figure is feeling or thinking something. In this case, St. George has a small chin, you know. He looks a little apprehensive, maybe even fearful. So isn't it, isn't the hero or the brave person really the person who overcomes fear, not the person who has no fear? So a beautiful example of the movements of the mind. One of the most famous statues by Donatello is his bronze David. Now, years before, he had carved a statue of David in marble. But this one is quite different. And I think you've noticed what's different about it. This is a statue in the nude and in the round, as we say. In other words, you can walk around it and see it from the front and the side and the back. You probably know the story of David, the shepherd boy, who rises to be the king of Israel. When he's young, he is taking food to his brothers who are in the army. And they are battling the Philistines, who are their enemies. And the youngest brother, who's David, shows up and sees that both the Philistines and the Hebraic army are on the battle, are in their camps, and they're not fighting. And what has happened is that the Philistines have this powerful giant who is, their great warrior. And every day the giant, whose name is Goliath, comes out and parades in front of the Hebrew army and mocks them. He says, who about you is brave enough to come up against me? Send your bravest warrior, just come, and I'll battle you in single combat. And if I win, you will all become our slaves. And if you win, fat chance of that. Yeah, I will become your slave, sure. Essentially, he's calling them all chicken. And he's huge, and he's powerful. And nobody is willing to go up against him. And when he sees this, David goes to the king himself, and he says that, this shows that we don't trust God. We had to believe that our God is powerful and will protect us. And he volunteers to fight the giant Goliath. Well, David is a shepherd boy at this time. He's a young man, and you can see how Donatello has shown an adolescent boy. And Saul, the king, how could you fight him? How could you possibly defeat him? And David says, well, I'm a shepherd. I have to drive off wolves and lions. I have to protect the sheep. And Saul says, okay, if you're willing to do it. And he honors David by giving him his own armor, the king's own armor. And David puts it on, and it's too heavy. So he takes it off. Now, here you can see a little bit of the remnants of the armor of Saul. He's wearing essentially shin guards on his legs. And he has a helmet, and this is supposed to be a classical helmet with a wreath around it. And so David goes out to battle Goliath, but instead of trying to battle him, with a sword or, some other weapon like that, David uses the weapon that he knows best, which is a slingshot. And he takes the sling and he puts a rock in it and he lets fly. And the rock hits Goliath on the brow and it strikes him dead. And he falls down. And then David takes Goliath's own sword and cuts off his head. When the Philistines see this, they flee in terror. And the Hebrew army chases them, and of course they win the battle. And then they give praise to God. This statue, and this is a very important point, you should remember this. This is the first freestanding nude statue since the time of ancient Rome. We saw that beautiful nude figure of Isaac in Ghiberti's competition relief. That's very, very small, and it's in relief. This is freestanding, and it's life-size. It's about 5 feet tall. It's showing David with the vulnerability of a youth. He looks like an adolescent, but he also has a kind of ideal beauty. And there's something very sensuous about the figure and the way it stands with the curving form and the hip outstretched. Some people call it an S or a reverse S curve. Now, the question, of course, is why is David in the nude? There have been statues of David before and paintings of David, but he wasn't nude. Why is he not wearing clothes? And I should make a distinction here between nude and naked. There's a famous article that became a famous book by Kenneth Clark, and it's called The Nude. And the article that it has incorporated within it is called The Naked and the Nude. And he makes the distinction that a nude figure is a figure with ideal beauty and perfect proportions. But a naked figure is just a figure that doesn't have any clothes on. And he actually uses as his example Roger van der Weyden's Last Judgment, where you have these, think about some of the nude figures we've seen from Northern Europe, where they may be somewhat slender. Think of Adam and Eve, maybe from the Ghent altarpiece. They don't look like classical figures. So, they look more naked, maybe, would be the distinction that sometimes is made. Well, let's come back to that idea. Why is David in the nude? Why doesn't he make clothes on? I mean, the Bible does say that he took off Saul's armor, but it didn't say he took off his tunic too. And we do know that the Hebrews have a nudity taboo because at the very beginning of Genesis, it speaks of Adam and Eve after they partake of the forbidden fruit, the tree of knowledge, the fruit of knowledge. They know that they are naked and they try to cover themselves. Well, the answer is classical antiquity. And this is the influence of classical antiquity and the introduction of the beautiful nude figure. In ancient Greece and Rome, gods, heroes, and athletes were shown in the nude to show off the beautiful masculine body. And we sometimes talk about heroic nudity. It's not just you lost your clothes. It's there and it shows your power, and it shows, how physically fit you are and how beautiful you are. So you'd have Apollo shown in the nude, or in this case, an athlete. Now, the figure I'm showing you is a Roman copy in Italy, the Vatican actually today. It's after a famous Greek statue of the 5th century BC. The figure that I'm showing you here is an athlete. It is a Roman copy of a Greek statue that today is lost. And it was a very famous Greek statue, so much so that the Romans copied it so that, different people could have this famous statue in their garden or in their atrium. And so we know of several copies of this. There's one, for example, in Minneapolis, another in Naples, another in the Vatican. And the original was actually a bronze statue by Polyclitus, sculptor of the 5th century BCE. And this statue was known as the Doryphorus, or the spear carrier, or the spear bearer. It may have been a warrior, or it may have been a javelin thrower for something like the Olympic Games. And you may remember that the Olympics, the original ones, not the ones they're having today, but the original Olympics in ancient Greece were performed in the nude. Now, they didn't have team logos and little costumes. It also had a sort of another name applied to it. It was called the canon. And Polyclitus' statue and the book that he wrote, which is unfortunately lost, the book was also called the Canon. And by the canon here, they mean the standard. And this was to illustrate the perfect proportions of the athletic male. It's about 8 heads tall. And, of course, it's showing that idea of heroic nudity. So what Donatello is doing is applying it to a Bible hero, a biblical hero, and to show the classical tradition, the beauty of the human body, and what this idea of heroic nudity, we have David in the nude. Now, as I said, this was pretty new. And he had to have a patron who would go along with it. We believe that the patron was the Medici. And that this statue once was in the courtyard of the Palazzo Medici. And the Medici were very interested in classical antiquity. And so, this is, we might say, very forward thinking of them. Now, I want you to notice the way the figures are standing. They aren't standing rigidly at attention with the weight on both legs equally. They're shown with the weight on one leg, and the other leg is flexed, as though it's ready to take a step. So you have this feeling of, a statue that has essentially some kind of life, that it could move. And it also has a twist to the body. And we have a term for this. It's called contrapposto. Now, contra, as you know, means against. Posto would mean set, so it's set against. And the idea is that the different parts of the body that can turn, such as the head, the torso, and the pelvis area, are set against, or turn around, the vertical axis of the human body. So if you think of the body as being sort of a vertical pole, and then the hips can move a certain way, the torso can move, the head can move, and they can actually move in different directions. They don't all have to move together. So these different parts are set against each other. Perhaps a better definition of contrapposto is the natural twist of the human body when the weight is placed on one leg, or it could be on the hip, for example, if it's seated or reclining. In other words, the weight is on one side of the figure, and that makes certain things happen. As you'll notice here, the hip on the weight-bearing side is raised. And the hip on the other side, where you have the flexed leg, is lowered. The shoulder on the weight-bearing side goes down a little bit. The shoulder on the other side is raised. And of course, the body can turn naturally in different ways. So if you were to draw a straight line out, say, from the umbilicus or from the sternum, the center of the breast, the breastbone, and from the head, when you have your weight on one leg or one hip, they aren't going to come out directly together. They're going to come out at a little angle. There's that twist to the body, which is very natural, implies movement, and also makes a much more interesting silhouette and a much more complicated pose. And in this case, a very beautiful pose with this kind of S or reverse S curve. And just showing you a few details here close up. You might notice in this one that it looks like there's a little hole down underneath the neck. And that is essentially a casting flaw. There's probably a bubble there. And it must have been too big to repair after the casting. And here you see David looking down, looking very thoughtful, even pensive perhaps, as he rests his foot on the head of Goliath. So we do have the movements of the mind. Here the face is not all contorted or anything like that. It's a quiet reflection on the part of the statue that we we imagine, that we can see reflected in the face what he might be feeling. And that's also true of the next statue we're going to look at. This is the Gattamelata. And it is also by Donatello, and it's created right in the middle of the century, as you can see. And it is an equestrian statue. And by an equestrian, you can see the word equus, which means horse. An equestrian is a horseback rider. So this, in a sense, is the granddaddy to all of those figures that you might see of generals riding horses or something like that. It is a mercenary general. It's a statue of Erasmo de Narni, who was a condottiero, or a mercenary general. I said earlier that the Italian city-states warred against each other. And how are you going to do this? Well, actually, they had mercenary armies, and they hired mercenary generals who were paid to fight for whatever principality. Erasmo de Narni fought for Padua, and he left money in his will to have a statue to himself put up in Padua, and it's right out in front of the cathedral on a very high pedestal. Now, this is the first life-size bronze equestrian statue since the time of ancient Rome, since classical antiquity. It does have a classical model, and that is the only surviving Roman equestrian statue, which is a statue of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. And you can see Marcus Aurelius seated on his horse with the horse has one leg raised, and Marcus Aurelius has his hand stretched out. Now, Donatello would have known this statue. You may remember that I said that in the early years of the 15th century, he went down to Rome with Brunelleschi. And I'm sure while Brunelleschi is looking at the buildings, Donatello is looking at the statuary. But this statue at that time was on a pedestal outside the Cathedral of Rome, the Church of St. Giovanni Laterano, or St. John Lateran. And there it remained until the 16th century, when it was moved to Campoline Hill in a piazza that was designed by Michelangelo. And you can see, just see a little bit of the buildings that are around it. Those are museums that were designed as great palazzi, as great palaces by Michelangelo. In more recent years, it was replaced by a copy and taken to that museum that you see to its, on your right of Marcus Aurelius. And if you're looking for it, it's under the staircase in a glass enclosure that's climate controlled to keep it from deteriorating anymore. But Donatello would have seen it. And when he gets this commission, he is doing something that has not been done since the time of ancient Rome, to cast such, a complex and large statue of a man on horseback. And you'll notice to sort of, make sure it's stable, the horse's foot rests on a little cannonball. So you have all 4 legs on the ground, or 3 legs on the ground and 1 on a cannonball. The next Renaissance equestrian statue, which is by Verrocchio and is in Venice today, it's Colleone, does not have the cannonball. They feel a little more secure about that. Okay, we said that this was the Gattamelata. What does that mean? Gatta means cat. Malata means something like honey. So literally the honey cat. We might say the marmalade cat, or the orange cat. I've even heard people call it the calico cat, although that's more English. And this was the general's nickname. Now, I don't know how he got it. Maybe he pounced like a cat on his enemies. But he was called the Gattamelata. Now, one thing I find so interesting about this face, this is way up high. It'd be really hard to see it. But the face looks very portrait-like. And it does more than just look like somebody. It looks like somebody with a lot on his mind. You can see the movements of the mind. Did Donatello actually know what he looked like? It's possible that a death mask was taken of the general after he died. They did that sometimes. If you wanted to have a sculpture portrait of yourself, or somebody else wanted it for you, after the person died, they sometimes would take a plaster cast of the face. One of these survives, for example, of Battista Sforza, who was married to another mercenary general who actually became the Duke of Urbino. But so that's possible. It could really look like him. If it doesn't, if it's just imaginary, it still really looks like a real person. It's extremely natural. But also, in a sense, it's almost like the ideal general. He looks like he has a conscience, as though he's disturbed by the carnage that he sees and the carnage that he's caused. Now, did Erasmo da Narni, the Gattamelata, actually have, doubts about the warfare that he was waging? I have no idea. Probably not. That was their profession. So quite possibly Donatello has given him his character and shows the movements of the mind. Now, I want you to look at the side view of this statue, because the side view, in a sense, epitomizes Renaissance harmony and balance. If we think about the horse's body as a, large horizontal band, that's balanced by the vertical of the man seated on the back. And you might notice that the man is rather large in relationship to the horse. There's actually a long tradition of this, where you would have the man be larger in proportion, because horses are big animals. And, a human being could look kind of puny on top of the horse. So, he wants to look more powerful. So we have the man's size, slightly larger perhaps. Then if you look at the diagonal movement, you have the head of the horse as a kind of diagonal. The reins are a diagonal going the same way. The leg of the general. And then and also the foremost leg of the horse, that sort of suggests that you might be taking a step forward. Don't do that. It's a steep drop on the pedestal. And then to sort of answer that to answer all those diagonals going one way, we have two diagonals going the other way, the sword and the baton of office. So once again, they sort of balance out and establish a harmony. Now, you might say, well, yeah, but, this is the shape of humans and this is the shape of horses and reins and things. So is that, really something that the artist planned? Well, let me show you something else. If you follow the arc of the head of the horse, you have this curving shape. And then you have more curving shapes of the head, the back, and the derriere, the hip of the general. So you have this repetition of a curving form. And also, of course, the curve of the haunch of the horse, the back end of the horse. And then look at the tail. The tail rises up, sort of tied there, in a curve that is the same kind of curve that we see with the back of the horse. A horse's tail could be anything. So to repeat that curve suggests very strongly to me that the artist is establishing the repetition of forms, the repetition of shapes that establishes a kind of rhythm and establishes a balance between the different shapes and establishes harmony, Renaissance harmony. Now we want to talk about an artist who was a painter, a sculptor, and a printmaker. We're going to look at one work of sculpture and one print. His name was Antonio del Palaiuolo. He had a brother who was also an artist, Piero del Palaiuolo. And the name by which he's known is actually the profession of his father. Palaiuolo means poulterer or chicken farmer. And the way people got their names, some great families like the Medici, the Strozzi, the Pazzi have a family name. But most people don't. And how do family names grow up? Well, sometimes someone is called after the city that they come from. My family name comes from the city Hull, so presumably some of my ancestors came from Hull, England, and the name was passed on. So, if they move somewhere, they say, okay, that's John from Hull, and then after a while, he just becomes John Hull. It's also the profession of the person. So he could be, John the Weaver, or John the Miller, who becomes John Weaver or John Miller. And in this case, it's Antonio, Anthony, Della, which means of thee, so son of the poulterer, the chicken farmer. And then that becomes their family name, just like, Miller or Weaver or something else. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about Palaiuolo's art is that it combines classical subject with classical form. And I need to explain that to you. About the middle of the 20th century, there was a debate going on between Renaissance scholars and medieval scholars. And, medieval scholars was like, well, you Renaissance people keep talking about this great revival of classical antiquity. Well, we had that in the Renaissance. We had the Carolingian Renaissance. We had, the 12th century Renaissance. We have times when there's some interest in classical antiquity. There's things like the moralized Ovid and certainly some of the poetry that was Latin poetry was known. And people debated this, and they talked about what would be unique about the Renaissance. Well, Erwin Panofsky, who we've mentioned before, was an art historian, and he wrote an article which became a book, expanded, called Renaissance and Renaissances. He used the word Renaissance to talk about the revivals of classical antiquity in the Middle Ages. And he came up with three characteristics that he said distinguished the Renaissance of the 15th and 16th century from these different, what he called renaissances, revivals of classical antiquity at an earlier period during the Middle Ages. One was that it was lasting. It wasn't just, okay, we have a little revival and then, we don't for a long time and then we have another little revival. That revival of classical antiquity lasted for a long time. I mean, even today, most school children know something about the classical gods. They know who Hercules was. They may have some misinformation, perhaps, but, if I mention Venus or Athena, or Zeus or Jupiter, it's pretty much part of our vocabulary. We know who these people are, and oftentimes we know what they symbolize. So in a sense, classical antiquity of the Renaissance has stayed with us without dying out. Another thing he pointed out was that the Renaissance had a very different attitude toward classical antiquity. It was an attitude that he called nostalgia. They weren't hostile to the pagan gods because they weren't afraid that anybody was going to worship them. That worship of them had died out and they became essentially allegorical figures, representing characteristics. But there was one other thing that he said, and this is something only an art historian could have come up with. A literature scholar, professor, probably wouldn't have thought of this because it has to do with artistic appearance, artistic form. And he said, Panofsky said, that one of the main differences between the Renaissance of the 15th and 16th century and these earlier revivals of classical antiquity was that in the Renaissance, classical subject became combined with classical form. Where in the Middle Ages, you might have some literature that was the classical subject, but probably most people today, unless they read the text, wouldn't even realize that the figures were, say, gods. So I want to give you an example of that. Here's a woodcut. It comes out of a book. And ask yourself, what subject is this? Well, probably most of you would have said, it's a knight killing dragons. Or maybe you'd have named a specific knight. I think it's St. George killing dragons. There's no way that you would ever have guessed what the subject is, which we'll tell you in a moment. Okay, what subject is this? Now, some of you will be able to identify it better. You see a nude muscular figure, so immediately you probably think, oh, it's a classical hero or a god. And then look a little closer at his attributes. He's leaning up against a club, and draped over that club is a lion skin. And he's, super muscular. He's got much more muscles than, they'll say, the Apollo Belvedere or something like that. And those three things, lots of muscles, the club and the lion skin, should help you identify him as Hercules. Hercules was a demigod, the son of Jupiter, or Zeus in the Greek, and a mortal woman. And he was supposed to be the strongest man on earth. His favorite weapon was the club. And one of his labors, one of the tasks that was given to him was to slay the Nemean lion. And so from there on, he would carry this lion skin with him and use it for a cloak sometimes. what I'm sure will be surprising to you is that both of these images have the same subject. They're both Hercules. Say, what? Hercules? How could the woodcut be Hercules? I mean, it's showing a man in, like, it looks like chainmail and plate armor from the later Middle Ages and the Renaissance. It doesn't look like Hercules at all. Because we have an idea of what Hercules should look like. He should be nude or, have maybe a loincloth or something, and nearly nude, and he should have a lion skin, and he should have muscles, and what? How could this be Hercules? It's Hercules slaying the Hydra. So you might call this medieval or contemporary. It's not an actual medieval drawing, it's just a little retardataire. It's actually published in a 16th century book. But this shows you a classical subject, but it does not have classical form. The nude figure, the anatomy, the things that we would expect the figure to have from classical antiquity. It has made Hercules slaying the Hydra into an image that would be easily understood by contemporary people. Hercules is a great warrior. Who would be a contemporary warrior, would be a knight, someone wearing armor. And this Hydra guy, what's this Hydra thing? Well, he's cutting off several heads, so we show it as two dragons to cut off their heads. Whoever designed this may not have understood the Hydra and probably hadn't seen classical images of Hercules. So that's classical subject without the classical form. But this shows Hercules with his lion skin, his club, his muscles, his nudity. We can recognize him immediately as Hercules, or, if you made a mistake, if you didn't know that the lion skin was a attribute of Hercules, you might have said, he was Zeus or some wrestler, some athlete. In other words, we recognize him, though, as a classical figure. Now, he's nude. He's got muscles. And specifically becomes Hercules because of his lion skin and club. So this has classical form. We recognize this as something that looks like it could have been created in ancient Greece or Rome. And indeed it is. It's a classical statue. It's not a Renaissance work at all. So let's see what Palaaiolo does with that. According to Panofsky, Antonio del Palaaiolo was the first person to combine classical subject and classical form, after the end of the classical era. The first person since classical antiquity to make these classical subjects, in the nude, with their proper attributes. There were many pictures of classical figures. You might have a picture, for example, of Venus looking like a princess, if you will. Or Juno looking like a queen, or Zeus looking like, a king wearing rich robes and a crown. Now, Palaaiolo did a series of paintings of the labors of Hercules for the Medici. Alas, they don't seem to have survived, although he did make some small copies of some of the pictures. One is Hercules of Antiochus, and the other is Hercules killing the Hydra. And we think that these probably reflect the larger images that he had for the Medici, and once decorated room in the Medici palace. And that was about 1460 when he did that. But we can see classical subject and classical form combined in some later works of art by Palaioolo. We think this is probably about the mid-1470s. And it's a statue of one of those subjects that he earlier showed in painting. It's Hercules and Antaeus. It's a classical mythological subject. Antaeus was a Titan, one of the primeval giants born of Mother Earth. And he was killing travelers. So Hercules was set out to kill him, get rid of him, get rid of Antaeus. And so Hercules goes out and he wrestles with Antaeus. And, he thinks he's got him and he lifts him up and he smashes the Titan against the ground. And Antaeus rises up, renewed in strength and vigor. Because every time the Titan comes in contact with his Mother Earth, he draws strength from Mother Earth. Hercules wasn't the brightest beam on the planet. But eventually, he figures it out. He's getting exhausted. He's a demigod, but really, this guy just never seems to quit. And then he notices every time I throw him down on the ground, he gets stronger. I've got to separate him from the ground. So Hercules holds Antaeus up in the air and squeezes him to death. And that's what you see. The climax of the action, which is very unusual in Renaissance art. Usually in Renaissance art, you'll have figures that are more restrained. But Palaioolo really likes to show these muscular nude figures in action. And so here we have a statuette. It's relatively small. It's something that you would put on your shelf or put on your table, and admire. And it's made out of bronze. And as you can see, Hercules has the lion skin sort of draped around his body, sort of serving as another support as he leans back and squeezes Antaeus, who is trying to get away. He's kicking at his leg. He's pushing at Hercules' head, but Hercules does not give up. So Palaioolo was very well known for showing these kind of wiry nudes, and he likes to show lots of muscles, and you can see how the bronze gleams off of the musculature. So muscular nudes in action is something that Palaioolo likes to do. And here we're seeing that statue from 4 different points of view. Now, in Renaissance art, we usually say that there is one main point of view. In this one, we might say 2. The one that's down in the lower right, you can see sort of the torso of the Titan and the profile of the demigod. And so that, and the head of the lion, too. So that's probably the main point of view. You could also see that from the other side, you also have a very interesting point of view, the figure that's on the far left, which is silhouetted here. And then from the back, sort of from one side and the other of the back. That's a very interesting point of view, but it's not what we'd probably say is the main point of view. We can't quite tell exactly what's going on there, and it's little figures are sort of compressed together. But there you have Palaioolo's Hercules and Antaeus statuette. Now, Palaioolo also created this engraving. It's known as the Battle of the Nudes, or the Battle of the 10 Nudes. And there are 2 states to it. Now, by state, we mean versions. And the first state, there's only 1 copy. So we say this is a unique state. If there were other states, other times that it was printed, they simply don't survive. And this first state is in the Cleveland Museum of Art. Then they have the second state, the second version, and that has been reworked. They've gone over it, whether it's Palaiologos or somebody else, has gone over the plate with a burin and darkened many of the lines, made them deeper. You may remember that when you are using an engraving, you are cutting away the metal, and the deeper you cut the line, the darker the line is, because it can pick up more ink in the grooves. And there are several copies of this second state of the engraving. Now, there's some distinction with them. You might have noticed that the lines seem shallower and perhaps a little bit more silvery with the first state. And then in the second state, the lines were darker and harsher. And here, we don't look at a detail of this. You can see that they are muscular nudes in violent action. They're all trying to kill each other. And it's taking place outside. There's grain, and there's also vine scrolls. And you might want to take a look at these muscles, how many muscles there are. In fact, they say that there are extra muscles that don't even exist in the human body, because this is at the beginning of this interest in the nude figure. And, the artist is really emphasizing musculature. Something else you might notice with this figure is the figure in the foreground with the raised sword, that his bicep is, swelling up, and yet the muscle on the opposite side of his arm is also swelling up. You can't do that. One of the muscles would be stretched out, for the one below, as if the bicep is flexed. So it gives it a kind of frozen quality, because it's like all the muscles are compressed, and they're in such, they're in such violent action, you have to compress all the muscles. Well, you can't actually move if you do that. One of the things that is really interesting about this is we always felt it had to be a classical subject. And some people say, well, maybe it's a gladiatorial combat, but it's not taking place in an arena. And, I thought about 7 against thieves, but there's not 7, there's 10 of them. So, what was the subject? Well, actually, someone came up with it. And I was at a conference and I heard this paper and I said, oh, why didn't I think of that? Because I didn't. There's 2 stories in classical antiquity. One has to do with the founding of Thebes by Cadmus. And the other one, which may be a bit more familiar, is the story of the Argonauts and Jason and the Golden Fleece. And in both cases, with Jason, he's given a task to do that they think is going to kill him. And he's given this bag of dragon's teeth, and he's supposed to sow them in the field. And from these dragon's teeth, armored men rise up and start to try to kill him. Well, Jason's no dummy. He takes a stone and throws it among the men, and they fall on each other and kill each other. And of course, that's just what's going on here. It's taking place outside in a field, and each figure is about to kill the other. You may notice that some of them are reverses. For example, the 2 figures in the center, it looks like the artist had a model that he drew from the front, and he also drew him from the back, and so he used him, almost like a mirror image. But everybody who's going to kill someone, here's the guy is down on the lower right, is stabbing someone, but at the same time, the axeman is coming up and is going to kill him. And you have 2 warriors going at each other, and there's this figure on the upper left who's letting the arrow fly, presumably at that axeman. Everybody's got somebody who's going to kill him. And so we have classical subject, now identified as the warriors born of dragon's teeth, and classical form, the nude figure with musculature in action by Palaiologos.